So my name is Lily Weber, and my research is called A Community in Crisis r/pre-med. So as a pre-med student myself, I'm very much aware of the fact that medical school admissions are extremely competitive. Um, so I and other pre-med students often seek refuge in the form of online communities to sort of deal with this fact. Um, and one of the most popular pre-med online communities is r/pre-med on Reddit, which typically functions as a sort of hub for advice, study tips, MCAT tips, success stories, and things like that. But as a lot of research has found, online communities often deviate from their normal patterns of content during times of crisis. Um, in the example of Reddit, Reddit often values, community, a sense of unity among its members. There was pretty strict etiquette involved. Each subreddit has a very specific set of rules and moderators who make sure those rules are enforced. But in the wake of the Boston bombing, which was obviously a huge tragedy, um, those rules sort of started to disintegrate and people were making accusations, often with very little merit or evidence to back them up, and the community was sort of very disunified and fractured, so sort of straying from this typical pattern of content and of values that you might see on Reddit. In addition, during times of crisis, Reddit often functions as a way for people to get their news and to get information about what's going on. In the example of the Boston bombing, people began sort of supplying updates about the investigation immediately, and people were really flocking to Reddit to use it as a way to get updates. So, on the subject of online communities during times of crisis, I aim to conduct a discourse analysis on r/pre-med in the wake of the pandemic over the past year. So, basically, the questions that I was looking at were what trends were present during three different time periods, those being March 2020, June 2020, and November 2020. I also wanted to look at how discourse changed throughout the pandemic and what were the features of the posts that were the most highly rated. So basically, what I did is I extracted two posts from each of those three time periods. And then I systematically went through the comment sections using a coding scheme that I created. And I basically looked for trends across different posts, within the same posts, and across time periods. Um, so this is just a table of some of the codes I used. And these codes emerged in one of two ways. Either they were things that I was specifically looking for. So for the COVID-19 code, for example, down here, um, that was something I knew that I wanted to see how people were talking about. But other codes actually emerged more retroactively, which was the case with application disillusionment. I was, going through the comment section and I realized that a lot of people seemed really fed up with the whole application process. So I created that code sort of after and in the process of doing the research. So basically, if I was going through the comment section and I saw someone who seemed really fed up with the whole system, then I would tag that as application disillusionment. So the example I have here was a user who said, I know multiple people who had a 3.8 plus GPA and 511 MCAT, not a single one got into med school. So I would tag that as application disillusionment. And that's basically how I went through everything. So this is a timeline of all the posts that I looked at. Like I said, there were two from each time period. In March, the first post was sort of about the ridiculously high standards that medical schools have. So that's why it discusses a 4.8 GPA. Post number two from March was about the toilet paper shortages that were going on at the time. In June, post number one was sort of comparing the accountability that doctors take versus police officers. So this was in the wake of the death of George Floyd. So that was a very hot topic during that time. Post number two was about the idea of pre-med students basically making up hobbies to try to make themselves seem more interesting on applications than they actually are. And then for November 2020, post number one was about balancing the value of the economy versus public health. So, should we reopen the economy if it means more people might die from COVID? That was kind of the debate that was going on. And then the second post was about a student's experience with being a medical scribe. So here is just an example of how I used the coding scheme to code the comment section. So this is the June 2020 post number 1. So you can see up here, I coded med student because this user indicates that they're an MS1, which is a first-year medical student. I code race here because it mentions Black victims of police brutality. Down here, I coded the medical establishment because it was talking about sort of dynamics in the workplace and how people might cover for one another in the medical profession. Because, of just power dynamics or, even if they see something unethical. And then down here, I coded for race and politics, as those two are often linked because, again, of the discussion of police brutality and of, race-based violence. So in terms of overall trends that I noticed from my research, first of all, the post and the tone of the post specifically tends to really inform the tone of the comments section. So if it was a sort of humorous post, then the comments would in turn be very lighthearted, joking in tone. And on the other hand, if it was a more like serious or political post, intense debate, argument, discussion would follow. And there wasn't much overlap necessarily. It was very much one of two extremes, one or the other. Another interesting thing that I picked up on was how I think more than the average internet user, pre-meds tend to debate with a lot of evidence and sources. And I just found that really interesting because it sort of mirrors the practice of medicine, which is always very evidence-based, using the newest research to support whatever treatment you're given. So I found that very interesting. Another thing that I saw was how the language use of users was a very interesting mix of sort of very technical scientific language and also just like the everyday vernacular you would expect to see on the internet, and even the occasional use of African American vernacular English. Additionally, kind of like I mentioned before, the most popular posts were very much on one side or the other, either very kind of satirical and funny or like very serious. It kind of tended to be one of those two extremes. And overall, the topics that were sort of most talked about were politics, the pandemic, as well as applications. And that I found particularly kind of amusing because, it shows that despite, everything going on in the world, pre-meds are still very much concerned with their applications. So to go a bit more into some of these trends that I noticed, so like I said, if it was a humorous or like lighthearted post, the comments tended to follow suit. So you can see an example I have here. This was, in the midst of all the toilet paper shortages that were happening because people were rushing to the stores and panicking about toilet paper. So this post sort of jokingly proposed that we should use Kim wipes instead, which are basically, microscope lens wipes. So you can see a very joking kind of post, more lighthearted. So the comments followed, and here's just an example of one of the comments. They joke, but staple them together so it's two-ply. So that's sort of one side of the spectrum. And on the other hand, if it was a more political post, the comments would not be joking. They would be, very much engaged, often a lot of frustration or anger. So in that example here, the post is about how, how should we prioritize the economy versus the health of the people? So very serious topic, and the comments followed and were very, intense. A lot of arguments going on, and a lot of just anger in general. So like I said, the comments really reflect the nature of the post, and the discourse is very dichotomous in this respect. It's one or the other. So the second trend I wanted to go into a little bit more is the use of evidence-based argument on r/pre-med. So I really did notice that. I think a lot more than most people on the internet, the users of r slash premed tend to debate with, evidence and sources. They're not just making baseless claims most of the time. They're really doing their best to back them up. So they're going to be using, links to external sources. They're going to reference experts in the field. They're going to reference, journal articles, personal anecdotes, all things that support their argument. So you can see some examples I have here. This person references a case study they read. This person, uses a sort of personal anecdote to support their point. This person literally provides a link about, a public health official or expert. Again, this person down here provides a link. So I think um, just it sort of goes against typical trends seen on the internet where people will just kind of make these baseless claims. Um, so instead, r slash premed users, they're backing up what they're talking about. And they're sort of not just relying on emotion, but also logic and evidence. And like I said earlier, I found this really fascinating because it shows how even before they, are actually practicing medicine, pre-med people are, sort of practicing that evidence-based medicine, and they're, providing evidence to back up the things they're saying. So the third trend that I wanted to talk a little more about is the sort of hybrid language that I observed, which really was meshing the more, technical, scientific language with more, everyday sort of vernacular. So you can see in this comment, for example, they used, phrases like hot take or big yikes, which are very sort of internet centric, terminology. You see a lot of phrases like that being used on the internet. And then down here, they use the phrase finna, which is, often seen in AAVE. But then they're also, talking about ethyl alcohol or 70% ethyl alcohol, Kim wipes. And that's sort of the more scientific or technical part of it. That's something you might know if you had done a chem class or lab or things like that. So it was just really fascinating to observe the kind of juxtaposition of the medical terminology and the sort of more formal language with the vernacular. And what I find most interesting about this is I think it really showcases the duality of the pre-med student. We have this extensive knowledge of science because we've taken all these prerequisite courses, but we're also still largely a young population. So we're going to take the phrases from our medical education, but also from our everyday experience. And I think that's just really fascinating to see. So in terms of the codes that I saw frequently coded together, the medical establishment was frequently coded with career confusion, which makes sense. The career confusion code refers to any sort of discussion of people who were starting to kind of become unsure if this is the path for them. So it makes sense that people who are sort of rethinking whether medicine is right for them would be fed up with the bureaucracy and the administration of it all. In addition, the medical establishment was also frequently coded with politics, which makes sense. Administration bureaucracy is often very political and tied up in politics. Community language was also frequently coded with humor/satire. And community language refers to, terms that sort of only pre-meds would know or understand, if they're referring to sections of the MCAT or whatever it is. So that was often used with humor and satire, which makes sense. I think a lot of them are sort of inside pre-med jokes. And humor and satire was also frequently coded with COVID-19, as well as politics. And I think all that also makes a lot of sense because I think this generation in particular often relies on humor as a coping mechanism for all the crazy things going on in the world. And also politics and race were frequently coded together, as they often go hand in hand. So in the future, I would love to expand this study by, getting to analyze more posts, creating an even larger and more extensive coding scheme, and not only expand the analysis, but also sort of deepen it, whether that's interviewing the users whose posts I analyze, using a program like NVivo to get raw data about the number of codes or how frequently words or phrases were used, So that way, this could be a quantitative analysis in addition to just a qualitative analysis. And I think the biggest takeaway from this study was just how much world events do permeate the medical field. Whether it was the pandemic or it was, the racial tensions that were occurring. All those issues are also very pertinent to the medical field, to physicians, and therefore to pre-med students. And I think that just really shows how many issues there are still in the medical field and how intersectional those issues are, just on the basis of the fact that all the current events going on are very easily connected to topics already being discussed on r/pre-med. Thank you.